Buongiorno a tutti.
Good afternoon. My name is Francesco Manacorda. We are extremely pleased to have with us Mr. Branko Milanovic for the first time at the Festival of Economics. He will present to us his studies on inequality. They are very specialized studies, but we have a crowded room here today, so everybody is very well aware of the importance of this topic. And by the way, I must tell you that tomorrow at 3 o'clock we will have a debate about the situation in Europe and what to do in Europe with a number of economists and also with Mr. George Soros. It is an event that has been added to the agenda of the festival. It is going to be at the Teatro Sociale. I'm sure that you will be numerously present tomorrow as well. But let's go back to Mr. Milanovic, who teaches in the United States. He has been for 20 years studying these topics, and he did so before at the World Bank. We will also ask him why he decided to leave the World Bank and devote himself entirely to the studying of these issues. In order to introduce him to you, I would like to quote a post from his blog, which is absolutely in line with the current events in Italy and Europe. It was on the 31st of May. And he expresses the joy of being in Europe as coming from America. He says, Europe is fantastic. You see castles, and you see everywhere Wi-Fi covered areas and beautiful forests. It is the best place ever to be in the world. People should simply be living happily in Europe, but it is not so. European voters, European citizens are unhappy out of several reasons. They dislike the way politics is. They have concerns for the future of their children. They fear unemployment. Jobs are at risk. Security is also perceived as being problematic. And being it so, he talks about two sort of evils, being the problematic situation with migration flows when they are so strong, and he places that within the framework of an income inequality scenario. The average European income today is approximately 40,000 national dollars, which is a standard currency which is used to compare and contrast, which is 10 times higher than in Africa, which means that there is an incentive to migrate from Africa to Europe. That is something you cannot stop. How can you tell people they shouldn't try and get to a place where they can earn 10 times more? And he also makes an example telling about Dutch people earning 50,000 euro a year, and you tell them if you migrate to New Zealand, you will get 500,000 euro a year. Well, most likely they would make the effort to say and make a journey to New Zealand, and that is the first thing. And the second problem, so to say, is that wealth is not homogeneously distributed. The difference in income and wealth, and in the two things coming together, which seem to be the trap of the modern society we have in Europe, this causes discontent. Obviously, Mr. Milanovic has a contribution, has a presentation, and we will also accommodate questions at the end. I will ask him how his theories adapt to a new situation in Italy now, not so much in relation to the institutional scenario, but to the political one. In particular, I would like to understand from him how come that at a certain point the left-wing parties discontinued their efforts and fighting to decrease inequality in income and wealth. And apparently it has been other movements that followed suit in that endeavor. Now the floor to you.
Well, I would like to thank everybody for coming here, because I know it's first Saturday and in June, so it must be, there are too many temptations to go out and to spend, instead of that, to spend time in the evening. This is my first time, as Francesco said, it's my first time to be in Trento. I mean, in Trento for the festival. I've been here for the summer school. It's a great place. I wish I could stay longer, but at least I will be here today and part of tomorrow. Now, I would speak for about, I agreed with Francesco for about 40 minutes. He is going to let me know when I'm at 35 minutes, because I would really like to have you, to give you a chance to ask questions, and I'm sure I would cover some other things in the Q&A. So I would actually now stand up, I think, because it's easier for me. Sometimes I think actually that I need to stand in order and to walk in order to start thinking. So if I sit down, my brain kind of doesn't function. As you see, actually, I'm going to talk actually today really entirely until the very end. And I'm not sure we would even get to the very end, but I would really talk about from the global perspective. So at the very end, there are, of course, things which are in my book, in Global Inequality, and in my forthcoming book, which is called Capitalism Alone, which deal really with rich countries. But as I said today, I really want to put it entirely into the global framework and to speak of the rich countries as part of that sort of worldwide approach. So let me go over the structure of the talk. I'm not sure I would finish with all these things, but maybe we'll do some of them in the Q&A. First of all, I would like to point out to two key features of today's period, of the current period rather, which are obvious, but by being obvious, they are sometimes forgotten. The first one is that actually I think that for the first time in history, we have a single socioeconomic model or mode of production, as it's called in Marxian terminology. We have essentially capitalism all over the world. And I think it's something very unique, because if you go back to the time before the Industrial Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, and you had globalization of the similar kind that you have now, you actually had other modes of production. Clearly, feudalism was very much present, and I'm not using the term just simply to say that somebody was underdeveloped. I'm using it in a specific sense that you had obviously first slavery in the United States until 1863 or 1865, and then you had serfdom in Russia, and you had very similar relations where peasants were tied to land in India or even in parts of today's China. So then, of course, after World War I, capitalism had a big competitor, which, of course, we all know was socialism, and it's really only now that it's alone. Now, I know that some of you would ask a question about China. I'm not going to talk about that. I will take it as a given that China is a capitalist country, and I can discuss that afterwards, but that's something that I'm discussing in the book simply by looking at the size of the private sector versus public sector, and I think that's very clear. Now, the second part, which is also like a big change, is the re-emergence of Asia. So what it does, it actually brings the distribution, as you can read here, the distribution of economic activity in the Eurasian continent to something which looks more or less the way that it looked in the 15th or 16th century. So in other words, it brings it back to the relatively high position that Asia had compared to Europe before the Industrial Revolution. So this is really, I think these are two biggest developments of the current period. Once again, capitalism as the sole mode of production, and the resurgent Asia, to use Angus Madison's terminology. Then this is, of course, linked with the emergence of the global, I call it sometimes middle class, although I'm not very happy about that, but let's call it global median or middle class, which is also a new development. You will see that in numbers, that for the first time also probably in history, we have, or at least since the Industrial Revolution, we have a significant share of the population that is now around the global median income. Now, I'm reluctant to call it the global middle class because in rich countries, when we say the middle class, you expect a certain level of living, certain level of standard of living, certain level of education, and so on, which that global middle class doesn't have, because there are people who are significantly poorer than the Western middle class. But they are still in the middle of the income distribution globally. Now, this is interesting also, and I will not talk much about that, but I would just sort of give it as an idea for thought, is because the role of that global middle class is quite unclear politically. When we speak of the political influence of the middle class, we speak of course, individual countries. And we have different theories that tell us, actually going back to Aristotle, tells us that the middle class is good for democratic development, stability of the country, and so on. But what was interesting in the current period is that we have the emergence of this global middle class, which does not have a structure of governance to go with it, because there is no governance structure. There is no world as a single, government or a country, which is actually accompanied by the erosion or the disappearance, not disappearance, but at least hollowing out of the middle classes in the rich world. So we have two sort of contradictory developments. We have global class at the global level emerging, and we have middle classes in the rich world becoming smaller. And the political influence or political meaning of the first, of the global middle class, is unclear. The political meaning of the hollowing out of the middle classes in the rich world seems to be clear, and of course that leads us to the issues of different elections that we have seen in the last several years. Then I would, as I said, this is a very ambitious agenda, so I probably will not go over all of that, but let me just tell you what is there. It is also, I would, if I ever get to that, I would mention political or philosophical issues which are brought up by looking at global as opposed to national inequalities. And these are the political issues, some of them I mentioned now, but there are others, what I call in my book Citizenship Rent, which is essentially the fact, or citizenship premium, is that the same individual who is born in a rich country and in a poor country would have very different income depending on the place of birth. Now, this is something that was a little bit studied by political philosophers, but really by very few people, because they did it in a very abstract fashion. But of course, this is the reason why there is migration, systemic, what I call systemic migration, economic migration. But it also raises some philosophical issues. It raises the issue about global inequality of opportunity. In other words, if I were to tell you that somebody, and of course Italy is a very good example, that somebody who was born, for example, in the north compared to somebody in the south has really the right to have an income which is twice or three times higher, although it is, of course, the case that in Italy there is large regional difference, it is not something that is taken as sort of a given, unchangeable, or desirable. But we never think about this issue globally. So in other words, we take it as given that, of course, global inequality of opportunity exists. So again, we have a dichotomy. We fight for equality of opportunity within nation state, but we entirely ignore inequality of opportunity globally. Including, for example, Rawls, who in his The Law of the Peoples basically sort of took a very negative, dim view about migration and about the existence, permanent existence of large income differences between different individuals. So this was actually, I already mentioned that global inequality of opportunity. And then I would say maybe something about what you might say, what is the global income distribution, optimal global income distribution. Basically, the essential idea there is that you have sort of two trade-off or two forces to play, one against another. Either you can actually concentrate your attention to driving inequalities within nation states down, while leaving, for example, inequalities between nation states as they are, or you can do the opposite. You can actually focus more on reducing differences between the countries and, let's suppose, leaving inequalities within countries unchanged. Now, the thing is that, as you will see in a moment, with the current structure of inequality in the world, it turns out that the efforts spent on reducing inequalities between the countries are more efficient in the sense that they would reduce global inequality more. But, as you will see also in a minute, we are now in a process where these differences between countries, thanks to China and India, are being reduced. But at the same time, inequalities within nation states are going up. So yet again, you don't have a sort of a very optimistic or very pessimistic picture. You have really to sort of balance one force against another one. And then actually, I like this ending. I actually, of course, play on Mendeville's that, private vices produce public virtue. And then basically the question here is, can national vices, meaning nationally increasing inequalities within nation states, produce global virtue, meaning reduced inequality globally and the emergence of a global middle class? In other words, is inequality, higher inequality in the United States or Italy, is this the price to be paid for reducing inequality worldwide? Or if you want to put it differently and in a very brutal way, is the shrinking of the American middle class the price to be paid for the rise of the global middle class or the Chinese global class in particular? So let me then go in some numbers. This is how global inequality looks over the last 2 centuries. This is actually the new numbers that I calculated based from the 1820. These are numbers that come from François Bourguignon and Christian Morisson. But I took their numbers, their income distributions, but introduced new 2011 Madison's GDP per capita numbers. So they look more or less like the original numbers that François Bourguignon and Morisson had, but there are some, slight differences, so it's an update. And of course, the most recent period here, most recent period here after 1980s is based on the numbers that I have with Christoph Lachner. So the very ending is based on our numbers. Now, what does it tell you? First of all, it tells you that at the beginning, let's suppose we start with essentially 1820, so we start at some point of the Industrial Revolution, depending whether you want to date it from before the Napoleonic Wars or afterwards. And you see that on the vertical axis, you see that the Gini coefficient here was about 55, which was, a fairly high level of inequality in the world, which existed even then. But then after that, you see really practically uninterrupted increase of inequality until World War I, and there is, of course, some slowdown there because rich countries essentially did not do very well, and then there was a Great Depression. But what does this increase show you? It shows you the effects of Industrial Revolution and the fact that the West and the Northwest, basically Europe, North America, Oceania, and later Japan, became much richer than the rest of the world, in particular India and China. So in order to simplify these things, one really can basically think of the 3 actors. It is really the West, India, and China, because in terms of population, they still today actually largely determine what happens to the global inequality. So, as you know, India and China had either stagnant incomes then, or actually in the case of China, according to Madison, even a decline. And the West, of course, there was a rise of the West and much higher income when basically the countries were launched on some sustainable growth path. So inequality went up. I will come in a moment to the contribution of the between and within nation inequality to that increase. But you notice that that increase is then continuing at pace until practically the last quarter or even last decade of the 20th century. There is a plateau, but there is no decline. So why is this current period so special? Is because we have the rise of Asia. Now, how is the rise of Asia reflected in these numbers? It's reflected by reducing global inequality. So it's almost like a mirror image, and of course we can project into the future what would happen, but it's essentially a mirror image of what the rise of the West did in the first period, which was actually increasing inequality, to some extent deindustrializing India as well. And then here you have a mirror image, which is the rise of Asia, which now reduces inequality because Asia is catching up with the West. And in the process is also sort of deindustrializing the West. Obviously, I don't talk here about the industrialization and things like that. I just look at the numbers. But as you can see, the numbers show you some kind of a, as I said, mirror image picture there. Now, what is behind this increase in inequality? I already mentioned that, so I would maybe speed up a little bit, is that you have two components. One component, as I called it before, was within national inequality, which I call here, just for simplicity, class. So these are really inequalities in all the countries that we have the data for, and you can essentially think of them as inequality between landlords and peasants, capitalists and workers, basically within each nation state. Obviously, these numbers are different because these are income distributions, but just to sort of make it more intelligible or simpler, just think of inequality between different classes. And then this is the gray portion. And then the red portion is what I call location and what I previously called the between country inequality. So it's really the differences between mean country incomes. Now, if you look at 1850, which was the first year here, you see that the two components are relatively close to each other. You know, location is a little bit stronger than class, but if you, for example, Karl Marx writing, as you know, the first volume of Capital was published in 1867, and of course you didn't know these numbers, but, you know, it's not unreasonable to say, well, in the current situation and with prospective immiseration or lack of growth of the poorer classes, the class component would generally rise. Maybe the location component would go down. As you know, actually, early Marxists were actually in many cases, very pro-imperialistic. You know, Engels was in favor of French occupation of Algeria. Marx was generally in favor of English colonialism in India. So they saw that in my language here, they saw the location component as possibly shrinking, the class component of rising, and if you sort of look at that and you say, well, there is a ground there for establishing an international solidarity between the proletariat because the bottom classes would be approximately at the same level in rich countries and poor countries. Then, here the next year is 2011, but I could have taken any year in the last 60 or 70 years, the picture would have been the same. It's a very different picture. It's really the location which is really the dominant component now, and the peak of that location was probably around 1980s, and that's why I put Frantz Fanon, although he was writing in the 60s, but you see the political idea behind the world, which is divided into a handful of rich countries and the third world of poor countries, is the world where location is a predominant factor in explaining global inequality. So, as you know, actually, Fanon said it explicitly, Mao Zedong also said it explicitly, the West is global bourgeoisie, and the third world is the global proletariat. And that's exactly what you had in the second part of the 20th century. So that's why I said I put Fanon as a sort of a counterpart to Marx. But then you say, okay, what does the rise of Asia mean for this particular graph? Well, the rise of Asia, because they are all very large countries, not only I mentioned China and India, but we should not forget Indonesia, which is the fourth largest country in the world, then Vietnam, Thailand, Burma. They are all very large countries. And as they are growing, and growing faster than the rich world, that's the key point, they are actually shrinking this locational component. But at the same time, they are becoming more unequal. as inequality in China went up, and of course inequality in the rich world went up. So the gray component now, in the future, we can project the gray component to be again increasing and the red component to be shrinking. So the question then can be asked, and it's obviously a very speculative question, I don't have an answer, and there may be some other factors which would not actually lead to the location component shrinking as much as it does in this graph because of unknown developments or difficult to project developments in Africa. But it could be that the world at the end of the 21st century looks in terms of the global inequality very much like the way that it looked in the beginning of the 19th century. So that would make then, obviously, the class component more important, relatively more important than it is today. So in other words, if incomes in China, as you do very small back of the envelope projection, you would actually find that China would reach the level of the median income of the European Union in about a generation, 24 years if I remember correctly. So at that time, China would be de facto another European country in terms of income level, and then the location component obviously would become smaller. But differences between different groups and classes within nations would be much larger. And there are many implications of that. I just wanted to throw one, to mention one, because it is really something that very few people have thought in the rich world, is that currently, and in the last more than 100 years, or even probably more, everybody who lived in a rich country like Italy was really almost everybody was in the top 25 or 30% of the global distribution. So basically when we talk about, distributional struggles within Italy, we are talking, or France, or the US, or so on, we are talking about a distributional struggle among globally rich people. So we are talking about the struggles that involve the global quarter or 20 or 30% of the population. What will happen with the rise of Asia is that Asian countries, of course, would actually gradually move into that territory of incomes. So what will happen in the rich countries like Italy is that you would have populations that would be, globally speaking, ranked maybe from the median of the global income distribution to the global top 1%. So even if Italian income distribution doesn't change, the position of people who are now at the 72nd percentile, I suppose, of the global income distribution is going to go down. So in terms of people's positions globally, Italy would start resembling, like suppose, Argentina or Colombia. So even if nothing happens to income inequality, so even if income inequality within Italy doesn't change, which I think is an interesting sort of thought to entertain, that you see interdependency. So even if nothing happens here, because others are growing, they're actually displacing people from their positions that they have now. So another way to say that, I will be very brief on this one, is that actually I did a simple, small calculation using Madison's new numbers that shows you China, India and Indonesia, with China and India as reflected, as their GDP per capita compared to the British GDP per capita, and Indonesia compared to the Dutch. And of course, I don't need to go over the numbers. You see very clearly there the period of a large first decline of those countries, the result of the growth of the West, and then you see the rebound of the countries now. So, for example, now China is at the same level compared to the UK that it was, as you can see here, in 1820. So that's the sort of recapturing of the Chinese position. And, of course, if we project it in the future, we can expect the blue line to go up and maybe, as I was saying before, maybe get to the 50 or 60% of the UK, and possibly in a not too distant future be 100% of the UK. The same thing can be seen, it's kind of a little bit complicated graph, but it can be seen if you compare distributions of China and the United States, even over a period of 10 years. Obviously, China's distribution, these are distributions which are normalized to 1 for each country. And then you just put them together, and obviously in 2002, relatively few Chinese are intersecting with the US income distribution. As you can see by 2013, these are the latest numbers that I have from China, China, there is much more intersection. So what you should then project, you should project these two distributions at some point really to look very much the same. So you would actually have the two distributions kind of overlapping each other. And just to sort of remind you, this is really over a very, very short period of time. But, over that short period of time, China had continued actually with a high growth rate of, 6 or 7% per annum, whereas, of course, the United States did not grow almost at all or grew, I think, on average by about 1%. So what is then the conclusion for the global inequality that in the long run is really determined by the spread of the technological revolution, by, I was saying before, the West in the 19th century, Asia today. But in the medium term, it is determined by three, if you want to think about that, by three sort of factors. One is what happens to inequalities within nation states. The second, is there generally catching up of poor countries? In that case, you would just look at whether poor countries without population weighting, whether they're catching up or not. And in the third case, really, this is the most important one, are the poor, populous countries really catching up or not? And that's really something that one has really to focus if you really want to, in a very shorthand, see what happens to the global inequality. So let's now go over the past 25 years. The first story here is one that I already mentioned before, but now I wanted to show you the graph. This is the global income distribution in 1988 and then 2011. What you notice there is actually sort of thickening. I don't know if it seems like I cannot. Well, anyway, you definitely see the thickening of the income distribution here in the middle. So that's something, as I said before, absolutely new. Danny Qua used to actually write about the twin peaks of the world. There was one peak, lots of population relatively poor, like India and China, Indonesia, and then there was a smaller peak towards very high incomes where actually Western countries were. But now, as you can see, the distribution looks much smoother than it used to be in 1988, and you see that emergence, what I call the global median class. Now, I put the numbers there. These are really not people who would be considered by any stretch of the imagination as the middle class in the West, because even the top, which is $16 per day, is really something which would be like a minimal income in the rich countries. So that's why what I said before, I'm reluctant to use the term of the global middle class, although, just for simplicity, I sometimes use it, and it's, global median class is a little bit cumbersome to be used. So I have to show very briefly, because many people have seen that, because based on the same data, you can calculate what happened to the incomes at different parts of the income distribution. And that became known as, of course, as many of you know, as the elephant chart. It comes into different variants. I can at least show you 10 of them, or maybe 12. Depending on how you actually define people at a different percentile, whether you use exchange rate to convert incomes or PPP. In this case, it is all done with international dollars. So what does this chart tell you? It's nothing new that I have not already mentioned. It tells you that essentially people who were around the middle of the income distribution had a very good period where their incomes went up on average by over that period by 80%, but behind these average numbers are deciles in China, which have gone up by 6 times or 5 times. And then there is another place in that distribution which actually attracted so much attention, and that's why the chart became so quoted, is that actually you don't have much growth around the 80th percentile of the global income distribution. So then you say, well, who are the people at that 80th percentile? And without going into many technical sort of arguments that sort of emerged after that, I can tell you that about 70% of people there are people from the old rich OECD countries. And 3 countries in particular stand apart because of their size: the United States, Japan, and Germany. And sometimes people are surprised that Germany did not have increase in incomes in the bottom half of the income distribution, but that's the case. Germany actually had a fairly bad period when you look at real wages and when you look what happened to the bottom 50% of the income distribution. Japan, we know that, and of course the United States, we know it as well. And then, of course, at the very top, you see that actually the very top of the income distribution, the global top 1% had a very good period. Now, that global top 1% is a little bit of a problem because with fiscal data that Piketty has been using, and this is based on household surveys, we know that the incomes of the top 1% are really underestimated. And they're underestimated in all the countries practically. So it is true that when we make some adjustments for that underestimation, the growth at the top 1% becomes even stronger. And also, we cannot really claim such a strong decline in global inequality as I have shown you in the very first graph. But we cannot, whatever adjustment we do, we really cannot reverse that decline. So the decline might become smaller, but it's not going to go away despite the fact that the global top 1% is growing. So another irony, or maybe sort of interesting thing of the global income distribution is that you see the rise of, which you can call it global plutocracy, people at the global top 1% who have been doing very well and whose incomes probably even rose, well, certainly rose much more than what I have shown you here. And we see the rise of the global middle class, but we really see lack of growth among the global upper middle class, which actually basically means lower parts of the income distribution of the rich countries. So if you want then to put that in political terms, you can see people there about the 80th percentile to be essentially squeezed between the competition from people with lower incomes coming with doing probably same jobs or willing to do same jobs for much lower wage, and what I called the indifference of their own top 1%. So essentially you can say they are squeezed between workers in China and their global plutocrats at home. And which also, for some who have studied, as I did, Marxism in the 70s, really sort of leads to another paradoxical thing, is that in the 70s when you did, development economics, there was sort of the term of so-called disarticulation. So disarticulation meant that development driven from the core countries would develop only entrepot type of economies in Africa or Asia. So you would have people, I suppose, in the coastal areas who would do very well, but the hinterland would be just left out, and actually there would be no linkages to the development of the hinterland. Ironically, we have something similar, disarticulation, in the West. I think it's very clear in the case of the United States, where you had probably 10 or 20% of the people who have done very well, who actually, there are several books, as you know, about top 1%, about top 10%, there is a book called The Dream Hoarders, about the top 20%, which is the elite, but the hinterland was left out. And the hinterland, and that's where this articulation comes from, and the hinterland, as it were, are people who are at, I suppose, 80th percentile of the global income distribution. So we really have sort of a processes that we believed 40 or 50 years ago to be very characteristic for the developing world. We now see them as being characteristic of the rich world, whereas the developing world shows some different processes, actually quite different from what it was in the 1970s. This is the update of the chart for 2011. The story is the same, except that the top 1% is less dramatic now because of the effects of the financial crisis. Actually, the first effects between 2007 and 2010 were actually very strongly felt at the global top 1% because these are the people who lost because of the decline in dividends, profits, and so on. So then let me just, for the global talk, one interesting slide, which is a little bit complicated, but let me show you in a minute what it means. Because what is complicated here is that if you look at this is the average growth rate at every 5-year interval for the world, global, and from the household survey, mean global income. But the interesting part is what happens to the mean and the median. The global median is the red line. So this is the growth of income at the 50th percentile of the global income distribution. So forget everything else. Just look at this last period, 2008 to 2011. You have global mean growing at relatively low rate, which is, I think, about 1.5%. But the global median is growing at 5.5%. Why is it happening? Because the growth in Asia continuing at pace, and these are the people who are at the global median. So they continued growing, and actually, as you can see, they grew actually faster than before. So we are very much impressed with the so-called global financial crisis, but when you look at the numbers, it should have been really called North Atlantic financial crisis, because it spread a little bit to the rest of the world by slowing down their growth rate, but it really did not markedly slow down Asian growth rates. And that's very obvious when you look to what happened to the development of the median and the mean. It has actually many other implications. So I just mentioned one of them, just occurred to me now because it's not in the slides. But the very strong rise of the median income in the world, again driven by China, India, etc., has the following implication for Africa. So you will see the interdependencies very well there. When China is becoming richer and pushing the median up, if you define the poverty line of the world as a percentage of the median, as is normally done, for example, in the European Union, where you take 50% of the median or 60% of the median. What is happening is that you have an increase in poverty because many countries in Africa are obviously not growing at the rate of growth of China, which dictates the growth rate of the global median. So you have the situation that despite the world getting richer, and despite the fact, or actually because of the fact that the median is becoming richer, you have more people falling behind that median and relative poverty going up. So that's where Africa, it just occurred to me to mention that now, but that's where Africa comes into the play. I have mentioned Africa very little until now, but now when we look at the future, because of the absence of catching up or convergence of Africa and high increase in population, Africa would start playing bigger and bigger role. It has two obvious implications. One, it might actually reverse the decline in global inequality and poverty defined the way that I just did it. And secondly, it has an obvious implication for migration that, was mentioned before, is that basically African population, which is has 1/10 of the West European income, now has about 1 billion people versus European Union of 500 million, but in 2050, or I think 2060, I forgot exactly, it will be more than 2 billion versus 500 million. So the ratio in terms of population would move to 2:1 to 4:1. So in that sense, Africa will be the only continent with really significant increase in population. So finally, this is maybe an extra slide. I seldom mention it, but this is the same elephant graph, but there is a small technical detail there that you keep people at the positions where they were in the global income distribution in 1988. And I think what is a nice illustration here is only look at these two dots here between Thailand and the US. So these are the people who in 1988, relatively rich people in Thailand, were at the same position here, at the almost 85th percentile of the income distribution. But what happened, these people in the US, which are here, are low decile. They're the second or third decile, so they're relatively poor people. In Thailand, this is really very high decile. So what happened in the next 25 years, in the following 25 years, is the decile in Thailand grew at the rate, as you can see, doubling their income. The people who were the same position in the US actually did not grow, 20% they grew. So what is actually interesting, this is what you invariably get in graphs like this, is that people who were at the original state in 1988 at the same income level between the US and Asia grew at very different rates of growth. So I will now have to wrap up. And I would do it by sort of showing you that there was no elephant in the previous period. So I took Bourguignon and Morrison data. This is actually the only data that we have. They are, of course, much inferior to the numbers that we have nowadays. But if you do exactly the same calculation that you do to get the elephant today, you actually don't find the sort of the particular shape that we have seen now. As you can see, actually the growth rate was approximately the same. You know, it's actually what is interesting is that the growth rate of the world was actually slightly higher now in this second period, but you see this is actually intentionally drawn on the same scale. So you see here the growth rate over that period was about 50%, but it was across board 50%. Nowadays, of course, you had this very characteristic bulge here and lack of growth there. So, you know, again, what we see today is something which is new. We have not seen that before. And, of course, there are, I think, good reasons to believe that globalization was the major factor behind that. So I would actually have now to wrap up because of lack of time, and actually I've already mentioned a few other things, but I just want to maybe show you the last slide, which is one, actually it's my wife's favorite slide, so I have always to show it, because it really illustrates, I think, somewhat dramatically the differences in incomes between the countries. So what it does, it shows you on the horizontal axis your position. Let's suppose I ask you what is your income, you tell me what is your income, and I say, okay, I know your income, I'm going to place you in the Italian, in this particular case I would use the US, income distribution. And then on the vertical axis, I take the same income, converted into international dollars, comparable dollars, and I place you in the global income distribution. So what you notice here, and this is done for all percentiles of the countries, you see that actually even the very poorest Americans are, at, as I was saying before, at 60th percentile of the global income distribution. I think I said 70th because depending whether you use very narrow definition of percentiles or you use broader. And then, of course, every next percentile in the US is richer and then goes up in domestic, national distribution, and in global. And just for information, the top 12% of the Americans are actually in the global top 1%. In European countries like Italy, rich countries, it's about 5 to 8% of people who are in the global top 1%. Which, if you want to be again sort of look at things from a different angle, when there was that top 1% demonstration and all of that, you can actually ask, like, who is then this top 1%? I have at my university, there was a guy in the sociology department who actually has a big poster saying, we are 99%. And wherever I pass by that poster, I think, well, you might not be 99%. You may be actually globally 1%. You know, they are obviously relatively well-off people. But nationally, he's probably, I suppose, at the 89th% of the American income distribution. But globally, he can easily be at the 99th% of the global distribution. So, there is even, it's unclear really who is where anymore. And this is for India with new data, which are income data. This is something which is new because India used to have only consumption data, which actually showed, of course, lower levels. But with income data, it's higher levels. And, of course, now you can see India and top income distribution actually reaching almost global top 1%. And if I were to break India into smaller units, because each 1% of India is 12 to 13 million people, but if I were to break it into 3 million, then of course some of them would be in the global top 1%. This is China, which is also with new data, which is the best that we have, which are the micro data. I can actually speak about Chinese data forever, but they're somewhat problematic. But given what we have, as you can see, actually already the top 1% of China is in the global top 1%. This is a lot. This is actually 13 million people who are there. But you notice also really significant poverty at the bottom in China because they're actually at the global bottom. like global bottom 1% or 2% or so on. This is Russia, which actually has significantly higher incomes at the bottom compared to China and India, and more of a middle class. Although again, you have to take that take into account that Russia's population is 150 million, 1/10 practically of a little bit more than 1/10 of Chinese. So the units could be, partitioned differently. And finally, this is one of my favorite countries, and of course, then you ask, like, what country can it be that has actually people who are really at the bottom of the world, but it has people who are the middle class? As you can see, the median person in that country is at about 60th percentile globally. Then it has people at the global top 1%. Well, that country has to mimic the world income distribution, right? So it has to look a little bit like the world, to be very unequal, to have really bottom dirt poor people and very rich people and significant middle class. And that country is Brazil. If I took South Africa, it would be practically the same. And the last graph, which is the extension of that, I just want to show you the shocking sort of finding, the fact that European countries, particularly rich countries that have a very strong welfare state, are not only just much richer than African countries, they are much richer across the entire income distribution, so that in some cases you don't have even, statistically speaking, overlap. So it doesn't mean that everybody in the Netherlands is richer than everybody in Mali, but it means that there is no statistically significant number of people in Mali who are sufficiently rich to be richer than even the poorest percentile in the Netherlands, which also can be used as an argument that whatever you think about aid, international aid, you really cannot argue, in my opinion, that aid can be regressive. In other words, that aid comes from the pockets of the poorer tax holders in the West and is being taken or given to the people who are richer than them in the poor countries. In order to believe that, you really have to assume really rather extraordinary assumption that the entire aid, for example, is pocketed by the 3 richest guys in Mali. But that, I think, is rather unlikely. So we have, I think, covered lots of ground, and I've probably gone over my time. I've certainly gone over my time. But I would like to stop here. Thank you for your attention, and of course, give opportunity to people to ask questions. Thank you.
Grazie molte al professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Milanovic, for this very dense presentation. Before open it to the floor, I'd like to ask myself 2 questions to you. Based on what you said, if we don't stop globalization, this phenomenon of a shrinking middle class in the West will never be stopped. We can see examples of that right now. At one extreme, we have Donald Trump's policy based on protection to protect U.S. workers, and on the other, some kind of ill-fated attempts in France of introducing a tax for the super rich. This is not easily taxed because assets and capitals are much more mobile than other production factors. So in order to stop inequalities within Western countries, should we stop globalization to core? And in doing so, is inequality going to go up between Western countries and other countries? What's the outcome of this game?
I will be very brief because it's a huge topic, and I did not, as I said in the beginning, I didn't want to talk about individual countries. I believe that the problem, I think, is the following. You have your incomes more and more dependent on what happens globally, as we have seen here with really interdependencies of the continents and the world. On the other hand, political decision-making or political transfers and everything else is at the level of nation-state. So it is quite understandable that people who are actually upset, for example, by Chinese imports have complaint, as it were, to make to the national government of the United States. There are, strictly speaking, two different options. One, as you mentioned, is are we going to sort of reverse to stop globalization? And the other option is should the governments take a much more active role in helping those people who have actually been affected by globalization. I think that it's to a large extent very clear that the latter option is much better. I will not go into all the details why it is much better, but I also see that it's difficult. One reason that you mentioned is that actually taxation on top incomes and taxation of capital is much more difficult now than it used to be in the 1960s and the 70s, where there were capital controls. And with globalization, obviously, where you can move money much more easily, you can hire workers, you can outsource. So it is more difficult. But in my book, I argue, and I will not explain that because it will take another 15 minutes and we don't have it. I actually argue that rather than being focused, as in the past, on the redistribution of current income, the new policies should have an objective, or what I call egalitarian capitalism, in the sense of trying to equalize endowments in terms of skills, education, and financial capital, which is extremely unequally distributed. So that should be an objective. But as I said, this is maybe a topic for maybe next year when you like.
No, è un argomento molto interessante. Sintetizzo io alcune delle proposte. Una...
Let me summarize some options, such as an inheritance tax much higher than there is at the moment in some countries, and then having education from elementary school to secondary school, which is more homogeneous and equal for all. This is, of course, much more the case in Europe than in the United States. And if I'm not wrong, there was a third aspect, which was the lack of incentive to creating big wealth and incentive for companies to have employee shareholding in order to have better distribution of wealth.
Ways, and you also mentioned when you introduced me about the blog, it really focused on the issue of very high inequality in wealth. Now, that very high inequality in wealth in rich countries, which, with a Gini coefficient of 90, for example, in the U.S., and it's not very different in Italy and elsewhere, the 10% of the richest people own 92% of the financial wealth. So what happens with the rising share of capital income is that essentially you have a quasi-automatic translation of that rising share of capital income into rising inequality between individuals. Because people who get most of income from capital are rich people, and they're very concentrated. So when Piketty argued for the global wealth tax, many people who have not read his book, they thought, well, this guy just says, okay, let me tax something, so I'll take wealth. But the logic is there in the book. The logic is I'm going to tax the factor of production that actually is really contributing the most to inequality, and if it's unchecked, it would really be translated into rising inequality quasi-automatically, as I said. And then there, of course, as you mentioned, there are other ways also to do that. There is, inheritance tax. There is a proposal that Tony Atkinson had. There is also what I also mentioned, a way to give tax incentive to small investors, to discontinue with the power of lobbies that were actually given lots of tax incentives to the rich investors. So there are many other possibilities. Let me just one anecdote, because I think always people find this funny, and I found it somewhat funny when I heard it from my accountant in Washington. I started paying my U.S. taxes because I became a green card holder, and during every election you hear first, 4 years ago, Romney paid 12% average tax rate. Trump paid 0. So I asked the guy, I said, well, it was in Washington. I said, well, is it how does it happen? He said, well, that's very common. He says, all my rich clients pay about, on average, 5 to 6% tax rate. And this is absolutely mind-boggling. And how? It is all legal, because they, of course, convert their incomes into different, either capital incomes or become actually company incomes, or they have so-called upstream deductions. So the top pays really tax rates which are similar, I would say, to the tax rates that the bottom pays.
Una ultima domanda.
A final question. You say you don't want to talk about individual countries, but can you please explain a phenomenon which seems to be quite global? This Western middle class crushed between the new middle classes and the global plutocracy votes, and they vote either for populists or anti-establishment parties. So how can we change this? And if we want to change it, what can we do? What kind of economic recipes can we give? What kind of income distribution?
Only for you.
I think it's difficult for everybody. If people had the answer, they would have found it already. But I just would go back to what I said before. I think it is the responsibility of national governments to enact policies that would actually help people who have been affected by globalization and technological change. And I also think that we should not, because of what's happening in the US and Trump, we should not really sort of change our narrative. I want to be very clear on that. I was always of the opinion that globalization is one of the major factors which led to the results that we have seen. And I cannot prove it, but of course I've used work of David Autor and others who have actually really empirically shown that the effects on U.S. wages and prospects of employment due to Chinese imports. But now, if you oftentimes say that, it is considered politically not acceptable because it seems to justify some of Trump's measures, which I think are somewhat unusual, to put it nicely, but we should not be actually changing our narrative or our results simply because politically it's expedient or not expedient.
Bene, ci sono domande al pubblico? C'è qualcuno che vuole fare una domanda?
Any questions from the floor? We have a microphone. And
In Italian.
can I ask the question in Italian? Yes. My question is the following. That part of the curve that you talked about, the elephant curve, where income doesn't go up, so they're practically stuck to zero. That's a mean. Is that right? So my question to you is that you probably saw curves for different countries without getting into the specificities of any individual countries. My question is, in that area, are there growing countries, but there may be countries that have declining income?
If I understood correctly, is that really what happens to the part of the curve where actually there is no increase in incomes?
Any country where there is actually a decrease in that part?
Oh, there was a decrease in that part. I have to think, actually, there must, for example, East European countries, which are also, I mentioned 70% of people there are from the old OECD. Other 30% are from the transition countries. From the old OECD, I cannot remember if there was like some parts of the curve where there was actually negative growth. There could be, but I'm not sure. It could be all small positive growth. But I remember for Japan that the growth was quasi-zero. As I mentioned, for Germany, it was a single digit. It was like 9% or something. US was 12%, but I don't really remember that it was negative. And let me just say why the question is, I should first check the numbers and tell you that. But also the question is very good because it actually shows that you don't have, in the rich world, you don't have necessarily groups of people who have become worse off in absolute terms or in real terms. But you have people who have not grown so that their position has deteriorated compared to other people in their own countries and to other people in the rest of the world.
Can you hear me? Hello, Professor Milanovic. Can you hear me? Hello, this is Channel 2. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Aziendale. Intanto grazie perché finalmente questa sera ho sentito parlare di economia a livello.
Thank you very much, because you talked about economics at a global level. This is not often the case, so getting out of a territorial approach. At the same time, let me ask you the following. You mentioned Marxism and capitalism as fundamental in your dissertation. I keep reading about capitalism and Marxism. We do much more talking about that in more advanced Western countries that have already experienced the shocks. So the counter shock of capitalism compared to other countries that have not experienced it yet. In your opinion, is there anything we can do? Is there any step we can take? Is there any way to sort of translate this line of thinking, which is not necessarily due to ill-fated Marxism or capitalism? Even in China, it's always been capitalist, a capitalist country, the same as for Russia in certain periods of time. So in your opinion, what steps can be taken in order to transfer this line of thinking from the countries that have already experienced this situation to countries that are still developing? I'm not sure I've understood your question. You want to know how the countries that have already experienced capitalism can export their thinking to developing countries? I'm sorry, but there's no microphone.
But I'm not quite I'm not quite sure. Why do you use why do you think of exporting capitalism if they already are capitalists?
No, he's talking about the idea of exporting the Marxist thought and the fact that capitalism has problems towards these countries that think that capitalism has a very long way to go. I think they're just gaining from this capitalism.
Well, I'm not quite sure, but what I want to maybe indirectly to answer, the fact is, actually, if you look at surveys, that leaving capitalism aside for a moment, looking at globalization, globalization is most strongly supported, not surprisingly, in the countries that are doing very well. For example, Vietnam is the top in terms of support for globalization. And France is at the bottom. So that was the result about 6 months ago. I saw that. I actually think that first of all, that, as I said before, they are all capitalist countries. They are just at a different stage of development, and some of them are doing very well and profiting a lot from a global supply chain, globalization, outsourcing, exports, and so on. And others are to some extent on the receiving end. And the receiving end meaning that they are actually not doing as well as they originally expected. Because I don't think that Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan would have been, they would not have solved globalization and neoliberalism with the outcomes that we have seen here. I don't know if I didn't touch Marxism there at all, because I'm not sure what Marxism has exactly to do with these outcomes. But
I think the gentleman means as a critic to capitalism.
As an alternative.
As a critic.
As a critic. But yes, but we don't have an alternative anymore. Yeah.
Ci sono altre domande? La signora.
Are there any questions? There is a gentleman here, then another one down there. One, two, three, testing. Can you hear me? Good afternoon. My question is the following. About the theory of international economics. it is said that the opening of the markets starting in the 90s should have led to a convergence between the economies of the various world countries. But if we look at the graphs, some of the graphs, it seems that this is confirmed. I think of the elephant graph or the reduction in inequalities among countries, between countries. But does this still apply if we take out China and India from that number of countries, or Indonesia? Because there is a strong concentration of that global middle class in those countries rather than in others.
It's a very good question. Of course, I couldn't go into that, but I have the numbers and I can show you a graph on that. There are really basically two types of convergence. One is general convergence that we study. It was unconditional convergence where each country counts the same. So when you look at that, there was, during the high period of neoliberalism in the 1990s, there was divergence actually, because lots of African countries and transition countries and Latin America, which had the last decade, had very bad period. So there was a divergence. Now that divergence stopped around 2000, because between 2000 and 2010, generally speaking, poorer countries grew faster than the rich. But when you do the second type of convergence that you actually rightly mentioned, which is population-weighted, where countries in the results come with their population, so China counts many more times than Chad, then you have convergence throughout. So in other words, but that's driven really by China, by India, by Indonesia, and so on. And actually until I think year 2000, the entire, if you were to take China out, you would actually have the increase in global inequality. So until year 2000, China alone was preventing the increase in global inequality. After that, India starts really playing a more important role, and in the future India would play even more important role, because China, by becoming richer, would actually move to a situation where it would no longer reduce global inequality. So it would be neutral, and maybe at some point, maybe in 20 years or so, it would start adding to global inequality.
Buonasera, io volevo chiedere al professor Milanovic.
I have a question to you, Professor Milanovic. What do you think about the possible effect where inequality has increased markedly and the middle class was damaged by globalization, and I'm talking about Italy? How do you consider introducing a flat tax on income in such a country? And what is the reason why there is such a popular consensus for a flat tax?
Well, that goes back a little bit to the question that Francesco asked me before. Let me put it in very clear terms. Let me put it like this. I'm very skeptical about the sort of I'm sorry, did you say flat tax or universal basic income? Flat tax. No, sorry, I would think of universal basic income.
Universal basic income is nice.
Yes.
We like to ask you as well.
Okay. Let me. On the flat tax, I don't think it's a good idea. I think simply the flat tax is, of course, non-progressive tax. So with the flat tax, we are going back to the situation from probably Italy had a flat tax or quasi-flat tax probably at the time of unification or something. So it's really, we're going back to the 19th century. Now, in many things, we are going back indeed to 19th century, So that would not be an exception. But I don't think I would not be in favor, because actually I'm in favor of more progressive taxation rather than less progressive. But when it comes to universal basic income, universal basic income, as you know, UBI has the agreement both of the left and on the right, for different reasons. On the left, they believe that, of course, if you have sufficiently high income level, you would have to tax a lot rich people in order to sustain that income, and they believe that basically inequality would be reduced, poverty would be reduced, because you would have such high UBI. On the right, they actually are in favor of the UBI because they say, well, once we pay you that stuff for doing nothing, just don't come back to us asking anymore. And I think that's essentially the reason why the right is in favor of that. I'm very skeptical because I actually believe that it would require philosophical change. You know, if you look at the welfare state, it is based on the system of insurance combined with assistance. But this is, you're insuring against things that generally happen. That, for example, obviously when birth happens, you're having paid leave for mothers and fathers. When you age, you have pension. When you lose your job, you have unemployment. So it's social insurance. So that's why it's called social insurance. If you were to move to UBI, you cannot have the two systems coexisting together simply because they're too expensive. Well, then you would really move to an entirely different system where you would actually have, obviously, citizenship as the qualifying condition, and you would actually really sort of have to forget about the social insurance system. Moreover, I'm very skeptical about that because I don't think that a society where you would essentially encourage people, I would have to say, basically not to work, would be a society desirable in itself. I believe that we have to pay people who are unable to find jobs or who cannot for other reasons, invalidity or something else, and that's why there is unemployment benefit, that's why there is social assistance, but not as a matter of principle that you might have like 10 or 15% of people who never got a job. I don't think it's a good society. I think actually working is very important. Homo faber. So, you know, there is a philosophical reason why I'm also against it, let's put it like that.
Congratulations, because you explain very complicated things, economic concepts, in such a clear way. I ask you, because you have knowledge about the international scene, and you also worked at the World Bank. Since politicians are not so much interested in fighting inequalities because they lack the knowledge, I think they are ignorant, I would say, and they are distant from the lower classes and the middle classes. So do you think, given the situation, that there are organizations at international level that deal with this issue, or is it just you, economists, writing about these topics? Because it seems to me that at political level there is no interest for these topics. Rather, I would say the opposite. People do not care much. And populism is this. It means being distant and remaining at a distance from the problem of inequality, of poverty, of precarious jobs. Are there international organizations, in your knowledge, who indeed do the opposite and are very sensitive about these issues?
Let me answer it in two parts. First of all, an easy part would be about the role of international institutions. I think that well, there is a change, but you know, the international institutions, in my opinion, really cannot have such a particularly on rich countries like Italy or, you know, or even Greece, you know, for that matter. They cannot have such an influence that they have maybe in poorer countries. And there we have seen some kind of a dichotomy emerging in the role of the IMF, because as you might know, the research department of the IMF has been very strong actually arguing about negative impact of inequality on growth. So they had several papers, they're actually producing them, they are even arguing that redistribution is neutral and so on. But lower inequality is good, which is a total change from what happened, like, you know, for the last, before that, for the previous 20 or 30 or maybe 40 years. But they did not seem to me, did not percolate to the level of operations, because recently we had a problem in Tunisia where the fund again followed the same policy of discontinuing subsidies and austerity and all of that, which it followed in the past. So there are different views. You know, some people think it's actually basically cynical division of responsibilities. As in the US, they call it good cop, bad cop. So you have good guys, but then you have bad guys, and they play that role. Or it could be that essentially the research department, I was in the research department of the World Bank, does not have much of an impact or influence on what the real institution does, or it might have it in the future, but not now. But when I come to the second part, I would actually say that the role to address, again, inequality, poverty, and so on, is something which belongs to national governments and to national politicians. And there, I totally agree with you. We have a paradoxical situation that never has inequality been so much in public focus, and never have people spoken and written so much about inequality. But when you look at policy changes, they are really very, very few. And the ones that you see, for example, like tax cuts in the United States, they go in the other direction. If you look at Macron's flexibilization of the labor market, it goes also in the other direction. So it's very difficult. You have sort of a paralysis at the policy level and a huge amount of talk and talk and talk at the level of, our level, but it does not have really an impact on policy. I was, for the first time last winter, asked actually to come to Davos. And I thought it was really kind of somewhat ridiculous because, these people have been talking about inequality for 10 years now, every year. What is the biggest problem in the world? Inequality. So they all say, yes, this is really, we have to fight it. And what do? They, of course, make more money. They hide that money in Paradise Islands or Panama Islands. They actually don't pay taxes. As you know, all these large companies have now discovered a new way of dealing, which is like not paying taxes. Rich people also don't pay taxes or hide money. So why are we talking about that? I actually don't understand. They should actually drop that topic altogether and do other things.
Bene, ringrazio molto.
Well, we'd like to thank Branko Milanovic for his presentation. It has been so enlightening. You've been able to explain very complex global concepts in a very, very simple way. Thank you.
I want to stand up here, maybe.